So last time, what we were talking about was the motor units, right? One single motor neuron innervating a certain number of fibers. So that each fiber was innervated by a single motor neuron. So fiber A, B, and C here were all innervated by the red one. And then D and E over here were innervated by the purple one. Each fiber, right, it wasn't this fiber was never going to be innervated by red and a purple one, just the red one, right? So a motor unit was a single motor neuron and all the fibers it innervates. Everybody get that concept? Right? The size of a motor unit, and some motor units were small. That is, you had one motor neuron doing like, say, 5 to 10. And some of them were really big, like doing like 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, right? So the one that did, you had a muscle that had a bunch of small motor units within it. You could have a lot more precise control over that muscle and how much force you generate. Whereas, I mean, at any given one time, right? Preciseness of movement right there. Then if you wanted big coarse movements, you had few motor units, right, with many muscle fibers, large motor units, right? A few motor neurons controlling a whole bunch of muscle fibers. And then we talked about those we're going to, within this whole muscle here, let's say you had 10 motor neurons controlling it, and you wanted to keep a certain level of tenseness in your muscle. You didn't want to be completely flaccid. So you want a little bit of contraction, not enough to have movement, let's say, but just a little bit of contraction. And in that case, you just do one of these at a time, right? Or however many motor neurons. And you do it on a rotating nature. So you'd have the red one go, right? Fiber, and all those fibers would go off at one time. As soon as this one red one shot off the three, it's 3 targets, it's 3 fibers. So if this was 1,000, 1,000 would go, and you get a certain amount of contraction. This one was pretty weak because it was only 3. So that one would go, and then this one would go, right? And it would innervate its fibers, and then the red one would go, and then the blue one, right? That way you can kind of keep a little bit of contraction at any one given time without tiring out any one particular motor neuron. Kind of get the idea of the motor unit and how you maintain muscle tone. We also talked about the receptors in there that would kind of automatically control how much tenseness you did or looseness, right? And any of those based on, particular contraction or stretch that was happening. That was one at a time, and you generated a fraction of the force that you can generate. If you want to generate a little bit more, you could do more impulses per second, right? This frequency of stimulation. You do it more and the muscles are going to contract more and more. You get that unfused, you get that summation, the unfused tetanus, the tetanus. And what you also can do is do more than one at once, right? We were doing on a rotating basis to get like a mild tenseness and muscle tone. If you want to, let's say you're picking up your cat, right? You bend down, you pick them up, that's going to cause a little bit of muscle contraction, right? Pretty light load. If you're going to deadlift, your body weight, right? You start from the bottom right there, you start lifting, then all of a sudden you got to generate more and more force, right? The farther up you move that weight, right? So you're going to continuously call on more and more motor units to contract harder and harder, right? So the more motor units that are contracting at any one more time, these are going to all go at once now, right? So that's twice as strong a contraction or whatever proportion as one at a time. You want to generate more force, activate more motor units. That makes sense. I think of, again, you want to generate force, you got to get more power because you're lifting heavier things, or you need to create more force in some way. So when you're doing that, like when you're making lifting movements, when you bend down to pick up your cat, right, your nervous system knows about how much your cat weighs based on experience, and your nervous system is going to kind of continuously monitor, right? So if you see a box on the floor, You don't know how heavy it is. It could be empty, could be filled with bricks. So you start lifting it and you find it's light, right? And your, not so many motor units need to be activated at any one given point. But if it's filled with bricks, you start picking it up, your nervous system realizes, okay, we got to start recruiting more motor units. We got to activate the muscle more. So as you're realizing, as you're starting to lift that and realizing you need to generate more force, you're going to activate the purple one, and that's going to still be activating. And then you're going to bring in the blue one, and then you're going to bring in the red one, right? You're going to bring them in sequentially, right? And these ones over here, they look like they're the same, but they're different colors, and we'll assume that they're actually going to be activated at different thresholds. And this is something we don't have to really think about right now. This will be, maybe we'll get into this in the nervous system, but some of these are just easier to fire off, right? They have a lower threshold of activity. You knock it 2 times, this one lights up, this one doesn't. Right? You ping it 3 times, and then this one goes. So they have you have thresholds. And then the fiber cells that this purple one is connected to are also going to be different. So this is where we're getting to the actual lecture. So we were talking about the number of active motor units increasing motor unit recruitment. The different motor units of an entire muscle not stimulated in unison. Some are contracting, some are relaxed, right? And then we're going to, that's the whole muscle tone. But as you're lifting something, you're going to recruit them, right, based on the need. And what the sentence in your book says is the weakest motor units are going to be recruited first, with progressively stronger motor units added if the task requires more force. And so we're going to, the whole thing about fiber types is thinking about what does this mean by weaker motor units and stronger motor units. Again, to pick up the cat, right, you don't need to generate more force, or the empty box. To pick up another one, you're going to have to recruit more and more. But you want to start off with the weaker ones because we're always trying to conserve energy, evolutionary speaking. Not when we're going to the gym and trying to lose weight, but that's the way we were designed, right? This purple, blue, and red motor neuron attached to likewise colored muscle fibers over here, right? Purple, blue, and, well, it's orange, I guess, right? Purple, blue, and orange ones. These muscle fibers are different from each other, not just from their little color there, right? They're going to be different types of fibers. And we're going to talk about what that type actually means, but just to kind of preface that, right? They have different, they're categorized into 3 different types of fibers, right? You have what's called slow oxidative fibers. You have fast oxidative and glycolytic fibers, and then fast glycolytic, right? So you have slow oxidative, fast glycolytic, which are the extremes over here, and an intermediate one over here. So we're going to look at what these terms mean, and really what we're going to go over first is this concept of oxidative and glycolytic over here, as well as, what the meanings of slow and fast and how they relate to ATP. So we're going to talk about ATP first. Right? So basically what we're going to be talking about is the metabolism, right? Because all those types are going to be categorized in part by the type of metabolism they do. That is how they create energy, right? And there's going to be these different types of creating energy, that is getting ATP, ways of getting ATP, and ways of breaking down ATP. Okay, so this is what we're going to kind of talk about today, right? How you're going to create chemical energy, that is the bond that is stored in the ATP, into an actual moving thing, the sliding filament theory right there, right? So we're going to look at how the muscle does that. First, going way back to when we first started, we talked about one of those biomolecules, the nucleotide, adenine triphosphate. And we saw that when you add this molecule to something, or rather when the molecule was hydrolyzed, as we saw pretty recently with the myosin head, right? That released energy and it allowed the cell or protein to do work, right? That might have been chemical work, enzyme activity. It might have been transport work. Remember all that ATP ACE pumps pumping out stuff against their gradient. And then this mechanical work, what we're talking about, right? So you add a ATP molecule, you hydrolyze that, right? And the cell does work, right? It changes its conformation. Maybe it shifts a little bit in position. It changes a little bit, causes a reaction to happen, opens up a channel, stuff like that, and causes stuff to go against its gradient, right? All this is work, and it's all done by this ATP. It's all done by taking this ATP, breaking this high energy phosphate bond, and transferring that energy to our protein in question here. And so again, remember ATP was that nucleotide, right? Adenosine, and it had that phosphate group attached to it. If it had 3 phosphate groups, 1, 2, 3, it was adenosine triphosphate, ADP. When you broke that bond over here, right? You release that and you got ADP, right? So this is where our energy, a lot of energy is stored. There's some energy stored here, just not quite as much. There's some energy stored in here, a little less. This is the highest energy bond. So to break this bond, go from ATP to ATP, right, you get a lot of energy, right? And all of a sudden you're going to take that energy that's stored in the bond and use it, kind of transfer it on to that molecule to do whatever kind of work you might need to do. And today we'll talk about that chemical work. Very basic concept, how this is your currency, right? This is the common currency that's going to be floating around the cell and, giving people its phosphate group, not people, you know what I mean? Giving proteins its phosphate group so it could do work. It's your currency of exchange, it's so called, right, in the cell. This whole reaction right here from ATP to ADP and a phosphate group, right, breaking it down from there is what you call an anabolic reaction, transferring the energy from this ATP to do work, right, to complex molecules as heat is released, right? That could either, maybe this, in this case, this is forming stuff over here, right, forming these molecules and stuff like that. And then there's the other one, the catabolic energy, transferring energy to break down from a catabolic reaction, such as glucose, as we'll talk about today, to actually form this ATP. Right? We're going to break down glucose over here. Right? We're going to be concerned with glucose, but all these molecules can do this right here. And so the catabolic reaction, this breakdown of glucose is what we're going to see. That's going to take the energy stored in glucose bonds and pass it on to this ATP. And then that energy can transfer that energy, not only for anabolic, but to do that mechanical work. And actually, basically, that's what we're looking at today. All right. So here's the slide on what you have right there. We're going to be looking at the fact that our skeletal muscles, in particular, our skeletal muscles they're kind of sitting there. They may not be doing much. They're always a little bit active, right? But not like overly more than most of your cells in your body. But when you call them into action, they need a lot of energy, right? So they might be going from a switch between a low level when they're relaxed to only using a little bit of ATP to all of a sudden needing a whole bunch of ATP when they're doing this contraction. And the more contracting they're doing, the more ATP they're going to be doing. Right? So there's going to be a huge amount of ATP in the whole function of muscle activity, right? So first off, remember to start the whole process, you need the cell to maintain this electrochemical gradient, right? Sodium, you need to keep a high level of sodium on the outside of it to get that excitable membrane. That requires a whole lot of ATP right here, right? This is why nerve cells, which don't have that contractile thing and any of those other elements, are so energy intensive. They got to keep a really, they're constantly going these action potentials. They need to maintain this resting membrane potential. Right, so this requires a lot of energy, right? Maintaining this resting membrane potential so that you can have an excitable membrane. That's one thing, right? That's using this ATP. Here's another thing, right? So that leaves that action potential running down the sarcolemma. Right? That would be ATP, based on just maintaining the electrochemical gradient. But once you get down there, these are all basically voltage gated, right, or mechanical gated channels where stuff is going to flow in. So these don't really require ATP at that point. But to keep intracellular calcium levels low, right, we need to have this pump activated, right? This calcium ATP ACE pump, right? We're going to pump calcium against its gradient, right, to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so you need to keep intracellular calcium levels low and inside this sarcoplasmic reticulum. So I should be clear here that when I say intracellular calcium levels low, what I really mean is keeping it low inside the cytoplasm. So it's going to be compartmentalized within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You're also going to keep it low relative to the extracellular fluid. So this is going to require energy because you're pumping in against its gradient. And so that's another thing you need ATP for, right? So that's two things. And then what we talked about last time was this whole myosin binding to actin, right? And using that, giving that power stroke, right? So your ATP was bound to the ATP binding site because your myosin had acted as also enzymatic activity, right? So your ATP was bound to that site on the myosin head, and it hydrolyzed because it had ATPase activity. It hydrolyzed it into ADP and a phosphate group. That gave it the energy, right? It stored it in its cocked position, right? And then the whole thing with calcium came and it released that, right? But once this was the energy provided right here by the ATP to get back over here and form this position where it was ready to go. Right? And then the ATP binding over here was to actually release it from the myosin. That wasn't an energy thing, that was just a conformational change by the binding. The energy hydrolyzation happened right here. But that happens, remember, you're going to keep on doing that, right? Every time you get a stimulation, right, a whole bunch of these, every single myosin head needs an ATP molecule to do that power stroke. And to get the power stroke, to get it fully contracted, you need a whole bunch of these in sequence. So you need a whole lot of ATP all around this area ready to jump in this binding site right here and be hydrolyzed. Just like you need a whole bunch of ATP around here to make this pump work. And just like you need a whole bunch of ATP around intracellular here. So you got ATP floating all around, just waiting to do its job, right? Keep an electrochemical gradient, pump in the calcium and energize your myosin head. Right? So that means ATP, you gotta have a lot of ATP waiting around to do that, right? So where are we getting this ATP from? Well, I said ATP that was formed, right, by the process of breaking down glucose ultimately. Right? We're going to take the bonds in glucose, break those bonds, do a series of reactions, which we'll go over a little bit. Take that energy, put it into ATP. So we have glucose. That's our, there are other things too, but we're just going to talk about glucose. Glucose is what's floating around in your blood. Your brain, for instance, it only takes glucose. but it's floating around your blood because you ate it. You ate a Snickers bar, you got the glucose, now it's floating around your blood, and then it goes to all your body's tissues and your liver and your fat and everything, depending on how much glucose you got in your body, and it goes into muscle cells. All right, so next time we'll talk about how the muscle uses and makes the ATP from glucose. See you next time.